what's up, Alex?
Oh, nothing much, Will. I'm just playing with my Western African claw frogs that are very real over here, having a good time.
Wow, that thing's incredible. I hope that it's able to reproduce successfully and produce copies of itself.
Uh-oh, I'm sorry, Will. If you're thinking that, I've got some bad news for you.
Hi, my name's Will Long.
And I'm Alex Dixon.
And today we're going to inform you about something you've probably never heard of.
All right, so before we get started with our thesis, I have a few quick questions for you guys. By a show of hands, who here knows what the chemical atrazine is or thinks they've consumed this chemical before? All right, almost no one. Now I have another question. Who here has drank water before?
Well, I hate to break it to you, but most of you have almost certainly consumed atrazine. Factories and farms should be regulated in the substances they use because frogs and other amphibians are being affected by agrochemicals and farm runoff, and countless other wetland organisms and the ecosystems that they live in are also being harmed.
All right, so to start, some of these chemicals, we got nitrate. Nitrate's mostly found in a lot of food additives, food coloring, stuff like that. We got non-alphenol, which is mostly found in like rubbers and plastics and other synthetic materials. And the heavy hitter here, which I mentioned earlier, atrazine. The chemical makeup of it is shown on the right over there. Atrazine is going to be found in your fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, a lot of your agricultural supplies, stuff like that. This is the stuff that's really going to get into the water and in the habitat of the frogs, but Paula will explain that.
Now, the main reason this affects the frogs so much is because of pollution and agrochemicals specifically. Agrochemicals are any chemicals used in the farming process, your herbicides, pesticides, and other things like that. Now, the way these agrochemicals get into the water, specifically atrazine, are by being used as pesticides. Now, atrazine is the second most common pesticide in the world behind Roundup, just as common Roundup, and the way it gets there is farm runoff. So when farmers use these chemicals on their farms, they just spray them all over, which is pretty normal, but then when the rain falls, atrazine is extremely water soluble, so the rain absorbs that atrazine and then it soaks into the soil and it gets in your aquifers, water, streams, ponds, lakes, stuff like that, by running off of fields and soaking through soil.
All right. So some of these effects, can somebody tell me, does anyone know what the term hermaphroditism means?
Alyssa.
It's when an organism has both male and female genitalia.
That's correct.
Toss her a frog.
Oh, sure. You want a frog?
Yes.
Oh, no.
Very good. That was good.
So frogs are not naturally hermaphroditic. They're what we call gonochoristic, which means they only possess one set of sexual reproduction organs. There is a common misconception that they are hermaphroditic. This comes from the hit blockbuster movie Jurassic Park. You've probably heard of it. There's a line in that movie where they say they incorporated some frog DNA with the dinosaurs, and then they became hermaphroditic. They started mating with each other when they weren't supposed to. And that's completely not true. Naturally, they are gonochoristic. However, with chemicals like atrazine, it's starting to make them develop both sets of sex organs. So a lot of the males are starting to look a lot like the female frogs. It's hard to distinguish between them. Another effect is the weakened immune system. This is pretty self-explanatory. The chemicals pretty much prevent the frogs from fighting off a lot of diseases like they're supposed to. And sex ratio. So there are a lot of big studies with rather large sample sizes where the sex ratio is 5 to 1 females to males. That means that only about 20% of these populations are made up of males, which makes it really hard for them to mate properly because of the disproportionate amount of partners. And among those 20%, most of the males actually choose to try to mate with the other male frogs, which does not work.
Now, the effect on this ecosystem is pretty drastic. Obviously, all the stuff that we just told you is pretty awful, but the biggest effect here is how it affects various other organisms besides frogs. Obviously, frogs are one of our big presentation topics, but it also affects other types of amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and it even affects humans, like we've already gone over. Now, like Alex said, the sex ratio in frogs is about 5 to 1 females to males. And what that does is it reduces the amount of breeding pairs, which leads to the bottleneck effect, which is demonstrated here. As you can see, there's genetic diversity in this graph right here, but because of the reduced population here as a bottleneck, the genetic diversity goes away almost completely because all of it is lost. Now, what happens is that when there are fewer breeding pairs, obviously there are fewer offspring, so that leads to even more reduced population. And it's just a downward trend because of reduced population, obviously fewer breeding pairs again, and it just keeps going on through generations.
Whoa. All right, so this is a video made by Professor Tyrone Hayes. This guy worked for a company called Syngenta. They made a lot of fertilizers and stuff that incorporated atrazine. They hired him to do some research, but once he did his research and he found out it completely ruined the reputation of the company, so they fired him and then pretty much tried to discredit him.
Now, during our research, I actually spoke to Dr. Tyrone Hayes. He's rather paranoid because of that campaign by Syngenta to discredit him, and he does not like to talk to outsiders. So, fun fact.
What's happening is you're skewing sex ratios. You can get genetic bottlenecking, which can cause crashes. And quite frankly, if you're a genetic male, it'd be nice if you developed as a genetic male. And now we have a chemical very common in the environment that's effectively sex reversing animals. I want to show you something pretty amazing, scientifically speaking. The one that's sort of remarkable is this pair. These are both males. The one on the bottom, acting as the female, we affectionately refer to as Darnell. He's a genetic male, but not only acts like a female, he lays eggs like a female. She has been exposed to atrazine all of her life. I don't even really know how to reference it. This is Darnell's third clutch. So Darnell has sons and daughters that we've grown up. You can see eggs in the bottom. This is actually her second clutch for today. She has been copulating for getting close to 24 hours now. This is probably one of the most remarkable things I've seen in my work. But I personally have mixed emotions. I'm very excited about the science and trying to understand the mechanism. But on the other hand, I am worried. This is the most common contaminant in ground and surface water and drinking water. And the level of atrazine that it took to make this male turn into a female is 3 times less than what's allowed in our drinking water.
So, as you can see, Darnell there had his third clutch of eggs that day, and I don't know about you guys, but I don't want a frog named Darnell laying eggs.
All right, some other implications.
Now, the recommended dosage of atrazine given by, like, when you can buy it anywhere as a fertilizer and a herbicide, but the recommended usage rate is 2.9 to 29 million parts per billion, anywhere in there, and that's a pretty arbitrary rating without knowing that Dr. Hayes there observed effects in his lab animals at 0.1 parts per billion. So the recommended usage rate for atrazine is around 290 million times what it takes to show results.
Some other implications are that among these studies, there were studies proving that women and men alike experience different kinds of cancer, from testicular, ovarian, breast cancer even. So.
And it's also shown that atrazine can cause many different kinds of birth defects in humans, such as gastroschisis, which is when you're born with your intestines on the outside, which is almost always fatal.
Yes, and among others is one called hypospadia, where the urethra is located on an incorrect part or not in the correct position.
And also cryptorchidism, where the testes never descend fully into the scrotum, meaning effectively males don't go through puberty.
Finally, our last malfunction would be there are many documented reports of microphallus, which I won't explain. You can look it up yourself. We have some graphs to pass around as well.
So Alex is going to talk about
To go along with the birth defects, you'll see on the graph on the x-axis it'll show it'll show the month of conception in women, and on the y-axis it'll show the amount of atrazine in the water. So in summer months, spring summer from around March to August, there's going to be a huge spike in the amount of atrazine in the water, and this is just going to show a direct correlation between the amount of atrazine in the water, and it has a vast increase in the amount of birth defects that we mentioned, even among humans. So.
And atrazine is actually the most common chemical found in not only drinking water, but aquifers, rivers, lakes, and streams. In fact, it's still found in aquifers in France, even though it's been banned in the European Union since 2003. So it's still being found in aquifers 16 years later.
All right, so some things we should do to prevent this. Support anti-atrazine legislation. In the European Union, like Will said, they have already banned it. However, the U.S. has done nothing of the sort. We can use atrazine pretty much as freely as we want, affecting all these amphibians and even humans. We can eat organic. Know where your food comes from. Eat local. There's a better chance that it's not going to have atrazine, or at least you'll know if it does have atrazine in it. And also, avoid synthetic pesticides, fertilizers like the one shown here. You can straight up buy industrial size atrazine fertilizer at your local Rural King or Lowe's, but you absolutely should not avoid atrazine at all costs if you can.
And there have been multiple complaints filed with the EPA about this, including one by Dr. Tyrone Hayes, and they've been effectively ignored. The EPA issued an official statement about why atrazine is still legal, and it's basically just completely dodging the question and saying, well, we don't know what's wrong with it.
All right, so to conclude, never mind. These factories and farms should be restricted in the substances they use because it's affecting frogs and other amphibians, even humans, which in turn is affecting ecosystem and potentially society as a whole. So we've told you why this is wrong, what you should do. Now, we encourage you all to go out there and save the frogs. Thanks.
Call your congressman.